Welcome back, everybody. I know in the last video I stated that the next stage of what we'd be doing would be to install MySQL and configure it, and we'll still be doing that in this video. But before we continue, I thought it might be a good idea to clean up and tidy up a few things and make our prompt, our terminal, a little bit nicer so that first it's easier for you guys to read for like syntax highlighting and colors and so on of directories and files, but also just to make it nicer to use in general in the long term. So what we're going to do before we begin is go and configure a global profile for Bash. This is fairly easy to do. In Debian, we have a directory, again, a .d directory we can place a new file into. So if we go into etc profile.d, we're going to create a new file in there. We'll just call it profile.sh. And what we can do in this is specify essentially things to execute when Bash first launches. You can pretty much do anything here. It is a standard script, but what we're going to do is set up a few environment variables and alias a few things. So before we continue though, we need to check whether or not we are in a proper prompt. If you've connected to the server via, say, SCP, or some other program that wants to automate shell commands remotely, we don't want to be outputting content to the console, sort of messing up whatever it is that's connected. So we first need to check if we're in a valid prompt. So we need to check a few things. So we go if we have the PS1 environment variable set and we're Bash. Again, Bash will be the environment variable. It's a simple way to test if this is the Bash interpreter that we're using. So just a simple check there. And then we're also going to check whether or not we are root or not. So we can change the prompt based on if we're a user or root. And that's very simple. We can just say if id -u equals 0, then I haven't yet got my view formatting sorted out. We'll also fix that in this video too. Now it's complaining a little bit here about the shell substitution. We probably can make that a bit simpler, and that's that. So that's just saying if the current ID is 0, so if we're root. So I'm going to copy and paste a prompt that I prefer to use for the root user. Again, this is entirely up to you. There's heaps of documentation on how to specify the prompt itself. There's a lot of escape codes in here, such as this / open brace 033. That's the control escape code, and then it sets a color and so on. Like I said, there's a whole article on these escape codes and a whole heap of information. It's very easy to find this info, so we won't be covering that. Suffice to say, this is going to change the prompt output. So now I'm going to give it the prompt I prefer to use if the user is not root. Again, I'm copying this from another window. Okay, next thing is to make ls output a nice colored syntax highlighted output. Well, not syntax highlighted, but like colored directories and files and so on by default. The way I like to do this, we go export ls options, color equals auto. And then we can evaluate the dir colors. So we get the default directory colors. Now, I'm also going to show you later how to load in a preset of colors as well that I like to use on servers I generally do a lot of development on. But for general servers, the default set's pretty good. So what we do now is go eval to evaluate. Again, we're going to use shell execution. So we're going to execute dir colors, which is a program. So we evaluate whatever comes out of that. And now we're going to alias our commands. So we want to alias ls to ls options. We can do a few other ones here that are handy too, like ll to list long. So we go ls options list. And then one I like to also add is ls options -la for list all. Now, I won't be using these two for these guides simply because we want to be explicit in the output on the console, so it's easy for people to follow that haven't gone and set this up. So then it said these commands say, well, what's that? So we'll save that off. Now we can make that active either by logging out and logging back in, or we can just source that file. Now you can see that the prompt here on the left has changed. We now have the user and the host highlighted in green. The current path is red and hash to show we're currently, or where we are on the, the end of the prompt. So if we do an ls, you'll see we're also color coded now in our output. If we log in as a different user, say we'll log out and I'll reconnect to the server as the YT user. You'll see our prompt there. It doesn't have the hash on the end because we're not root. We've got $1 instead. That's what the if user ID 0 was checking for. And again, because we have that as a global profile, it set up the aliases for everyone, not just the root user. So we'll go back out of that and come back in as root. Now, what I'm going to do next is show you how to set up a nice set of color coding. Some people find it hard to read these dark blues and stuff. And the default color set, like I said before, comes from dir colors. We can actually run that and you can see the default set and how it's got in here, like for .tiff, .og, and all the different coloring it's going to use for different things. If we switch across to Chrome here, this is a nice Git repository by this fellow Trapdoor that maintains a very complete list of ls colors, which covers a ton of extensions and formats, and it's quite nice. It's actually one of the better ones in my opinion. And installing it's very, very simple. I like to install it globally. Here he's suggesting to install it into the user's home directory, but like I said, I like to do this globally on servers I maintain. So what we're going to do is take this and we're going to change the output path. Obviously we need to be root to this because we're going to be writing this into a directory that's only writable by root. And I'm just going to create this in etc and we'll just go ls colors. There we go. So now what we need to do is essentially, I didn't show that. Let me jump across. I ran this command here just now. So I just changed the end of that to output to etc ls colors. Now, what we're going to do now is configure the global profile. We're going to go back in to profile.d profile.sh, which is the file we created earlier. And we're going to change this up a little bit to, instead of just evaluating the default dir colors, we're going to tell it to evaluate etc ls colors. And if we save that, and again, source this file, and now we do an ls, you'll see that all the hidden files, the hidden actual files is hidden directories have come up as a green color instead of the blue before. If we ls on the home directory, the symlinks are gray, the temp directory is sort of a pinkish color. If we go to bin, we'll list all the binaries. So you can see we've got a different color set entirely, and this might be easier to read, and that's what we're going to use on this server from this point onwards. So moving on, we're now going to do what was originally intended of this video, which was to install a database and configure PHP for use of that database. Now, we could install MySQL, but Debian have switched across to MariaDB. If you're unfamiliar with MariaDB, it's a port of MySQL. Because what happened was, some time ago, MySQL were bought out by Oracle. Oracle, not saying that they're a bad company or anything, but a lot of people were concerned that Oracle would close off the development of MySQL because Oracle have a competing database engine. So it was a bit of a surprise to everyone when Oracle took over MySQL and a bit of a worry. And what happened was MariaDB was formed. Actually, I believe MariaDB was already sort of coming along, but it got a lot of support when it became a licensing issue with Oracle, or potential licensing issue down the track. So MariaDB is a fork of MySQL that is guaranteed to stay open source, which is why Debian are now promoting it, and a lot of distributions now promote it. It also has some updates and features in it that MySQL doesn't have, as well as a bit better compatibility with different things. But for all intents and purposes, it is still MySQL. So to install this under Linux on the VPS, because Debian, like I said, used to deploy MySQL and now they deploy MariaDB, the MySQL package is an alias of MariaDB. So all we have to do is get apt-get install MySQL server. And you'll see here, it's going to pull in MariaDB server instead. So we'll accept that and let that install. Not quite sure why that's hung there. Oh, there it goes. All right. So now we have a running MySQL server. We can connect to that with the MySQL command. By default, it'll connect as root, but it's a good habit to specify the user anyway. You might have a .mycnf file that's changing the user or whatever, who knows, but we'll connect to that and you'll see we're now connected to the database to the server, and we can now execute SQL queries such as show databases. You'll see there we have 3 databases: Information Schema, MySQL, and Performance Schema. Information Schema is a metadatabase. It doesn't actually contain any actual tables. They're all virtual tables and they reference the contents of, or the statistics of, the whole server itself, or what tables are loaded into the server. The MySQL database is literally the database for accounts and table management and so on. So all the users are in there. For example, if we go select star from MySQL user, you'll see we've just got the root user in there at the moment. Handy tip if you're running SQL queries on the console is that you can, instead of doing this horizontal output when you've got a whole heap of columns like this, instead of using a semicolon, if you go /G, you'll get a vertical list, which is much easier when you've got a whole ton of columns to try and pick out and read the output. So for the moment, we're going to quit out of that because now that's all set up and ready to go. Note that under Debian, the root user is using this plugin to authenticate the Unix socket, which means the root user doesn't actually have a password, nor does it need one. You cannot log in as the root user unless you're on the physical machine as root. So it's a bit nicer than having to maintain a password on that account, but you can switch it back across if you want. But again, I'm not going to go into that in this guide. What we're now going to do is add PHP support to MySQL support to PHP. So first, I'll switch back across to Chrome, and we'll open a tab, and we'll go to yt.hostfusion.com/test.php, which I've left there from the previous video. If we have a look down here for PDO, you'll see we have the PDO support. And at the moment, the only driver it has loaded is SQLite, because that's the only one we installed in the previous video. Until we load in the MySQL support, PHP can't talk to it. So back in the terminal, all we have to do to fix that is apt-get install PHP 7.0 -MySQL. Now we simply need to reload PHP 7 FPM. Restart, sorry. And now if I reload over here, you'll see MySQL is turned up. And if we go and look for the PDO, because it's moved now, you'll see here PDO drivers, MySQL. So we're ready to go with PHP to MySQL. So if we jump across to the home, actually I won't do that yet. We're going to need to create a database for the website. Now, I'm going to demonstrate how to set up, as a simple example, WordPress. Simply because a lot of people will be wanting to run WordPress. It's extremely popular, but this applies to basically any site that has a database backend. So first things first is we need to create a database for WordPress. So we'll connect back to the database, to MySQL, and then what we'll do is we'll create a database. Create database. Now, the naming is up to you. I prefer to keep it simple and sort of easy to maintain by specifying the user account name and then underscore and the what the database is for. In this case, is WordPress. So we'll just say WP. So now we have the database YT_WP. So if we go show databases, you'll see there now we have the extra database down the bottom. You'll note over here, we have none. That means we currently have no database selected for our command. So anything we run, it's unless we specify the actual database by saying like mysql.user, like I did earlier, it doesn't know what table you're going to reference. So to enter into a database, the command is use. So we go use YT_WP. You see here, database changed, and now we're reading that we're on the YT database, YTWP database. We can list the tables in this database, which there'll be none because we haven't done anything yet. But to list the tables, it's as simple as show tables. So what we need to do now is to populate this with the WordPress database. But before we do that, we need to create an account that the YT user can log in as, that can access, update, insert, and delete records from this database. That's fairly simple. So we just go create user, and the user is going to be YT_WP. I like to keep the username the same as the database. The access for this user is only ever going to be from the local host. That's to prevent somebody from connecting to the server from another server elsewhere and trying to log in as this user. It's sort of another layer of security. And then we're going to specify its password. So you say identified. Oops. Identified by, and a password in quotes, but I've already got on another screen. Hold on. Now I'm going to change this password later because obviously I don't want the whole world knowing what the database password is, but while I'm recording this example, this is the password we'll be using. So I'll execute that, and we now have a user using that password. The next step is to grant that user access to the YT_WP database. It needs to be able to create tables, select tables, drop tables, insert records, and delete records. So that's basically all permissions other than the super permissions for the root user. So we can simply do that by going grant all on YT_WP.star. So grant all permissions. Now all is just a macro. It doesn't include the super or global super permissions. So it's safe to run grant all on the database. Now we're going to say YT_WP.star. The .star is saying any table that exists now or will exist in the future under that database only. So we're going to grant all permissions on all tables in that database to the user. So to YT_WP at localhost. Make sure you don't omit that at localhost. If you do not have it there, it's going to create a default user that's accessible from anywhere without a password because we haven't specified a password. So that's done. Now we should be in a position ready to go and install WordPress. So we're going to exit out of the database client. We're going to go to the home directory of the user, so home YT public HTML, and we're going to remove everything here, which are our test files from earlier. And we're also going to now we're going to go and download and install WordPress. So I've already got it over here, and we're just going to grab from here the compressed tar GZ file. We just grab the address because we're going to download it straight to the server. So if we go wget and just paste in our URL. So now we want to decompress that file. Now WordPress puts all its files inside a directory. We're going to strip that directory off the path as well. So we'll go tar, extract, zip file, WordPress, strip 1. That'll strip the first directory out of the path. So anything, because everything's in a subdirectory called WordPress. So if we run that, we should now see, everything in our current directory, including the archive we just downloaded. So to clean up, we also want to remove that archive. Now, you might note that these files are owned by someone with the ID 1006. That's whoever WordPress, or whoever made the archive for WordPress was running as when they compressed that archive. We need to change that to YT, and we also need to fix the file mode permissions. So we go change ownership, YT, on everything recursively. So if we list again, you'll see now that everything is owned by the YT user and group. Now, to change the group ownership, we need to do it a little bit different compared to last time. We have directories here, and if you're not familiar with POSIX file security and file permissions, the X on a directory, while on files, X means execute. You can run this on the shell as a script. On a directory, X means that you can, or execute means you can enter that directory and list its contents and see the files inside it. Doesn't necessarily mean you can read the files, but you can see the listing of file names. Nginx is going to need to be able to both read and list the contents of these directories. So rather than having to do some funky command to try and set the files without execute and the directories with execute, we can use the longhand chmod command to do this specifically. And it's not that hard. What we need to do is the following. So we go chmod. We want to say the users get read and write access. Group gets read-only access. Everyone else gets nothing. Now this is the extra bit. We're going to say the user also gets execute. Now the capital X, like this is saying add to the user mode. Execute, but the capital X means add it only to directories. We also need to do the same thing for group. So we can say group plus X, and we want to run that on everything recursively inside this directory. So now if we list, you'll see our files are correctly owned without any permissions for everyone else. On directories, this is a directory here, we have read and execute. For the owner, we have read, write, execute, but for files, note, they do not have the execute bit set. So that should be all we need. WordPress should be ready to go. If we jump back across to our browser, we can go to the page we're on earlier. And because we removed this, we can just go back to the index, and you see now WordPress is ready to install. So we'll just say, let's go. And now we can provide the credentials for the database we created earlier. So the database name is YT_WP. The username is the same. The password, I'll just copy that onto my clipboard again, is that. The host is localhost because PHP is connecting to the same server it's running on, so it'll be localhost. The table prefix, that's up to you. That's your personal preference. I prefer to keep it standard and just to leave WP_ in there. That way, when you're running multiple sites on different databases, you can use the same query without having to muck about if you're doing something complex. So we submit that, and you can see it's happy with the details. So we can now run the installation and proceed through this. Now, I'm not going to proceed. This is all just WordPress specific stuff, and I'm sure you guys can go through and set titles up and username and so on. I'll do this off camera so that any details I enter here are not publicized. But that's everything we need for setting up a database for MySQL to communicate with the database. There are more things you can do to performance tune the database. There's a really handy script called MySQL Tuner. If you download this script and run this on the server, it'll analyze the existing MySQL setup and give you suggested changes to your configuration, things you can do to improve configuration and performance. But it's best to run this after your database has been up and running for a few days and you've had traffic on the website, sort of your usual traffic, and then it'll try and give you some good advice as to things you should change on your database configuration. Things such as giving some memory to, say, the InnoDB engine so it can cache your databases in memory. But that's a whole nother topic. I'm not going to go into tuning MySQL because that can vary wildly, and it's usually done on a case-by-case basis depending on what the site's running and what your requirements are. So what we're going to do now finally is jump back to the server, and remembering this is a virtual machine, we now have a full web stack running. And because of the way we've built this server out, and being a virtual machine, being bare bones, we should see very, very low memory usage. So if we run htop, so as you can see here, the server only has 167 meg consumed out of the 1 gig that it has been provided with. That shows how much more this server can grow. For example, if you start to end up with database performance issues, you have enough memory here to be able to tell MySQL to hold the database in RAM, which can improve performance enormously. The difference is great. And the MySQL tuner script I referenced earlier can help you to configure that. It will sort of tell you how much memory MySQL is going to consume in total and whether or not you have enough memory to do that, or you're going to overcommit and perhaps cause problems. One other thing to watch out for when running servers in general is your swap usage. General rule of thumb for hosting, if you see any swap usage at all, that's a bad sign. It means you don't have enough RAM, or you've overcommitted memory somewhere. So like I said, perhaps in MySQL, you've configured too much memory per connection to be consumed. If you're using swap, you're in trouble. You need to fix that because swap is so much slower than system memory. And what will happen is when a ton of requests come in at once and you're already using swap, each request will slow down in its time it takes to process, and then they backlog. You end up compounding the issue, and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse until either you're out of memory and the kernel steps in and starts killing processes, and it might kill something like, say, MySQL or Nginx, and then your whole site's down. Or the site just becomes so slow it's unusable. It can even get to the point where you can't SSH in because there's not enough memory to spawn a shell session, and that's like real dire situation. So if you ever see a server consuming swap, you need to address that as quick as possible. It is usual, though, to see this consume a little bit. The kernel may kick some files into swap that it's cached. It does happen from time to time. If you see more than maybe a megabyte or two of usage here, you need to start monitoring it closely and see what's going on and if it's an actual cause for concern. You can also adjust the kernel swappiness, they call it. That's in the proc virtual file. You can set the kernel swappiness, and you can basically tell it to never put things in swap unless it's in desperate need for it. But if you do things right, you don't have to worry about that at all, really, and things shouldn't end up in swap anyway. But I think I've covered everything for this video. I'd like to thank you for your time listening. I'd especially like to thank those that are donating through Patreon, those that have donated through PayPal, and it seems that somebody's also donated through Bitcoin just recently. And I really like to thank those that are donating, because the time involved in creating this content and sharing this knowledge is quite large. I do have a business to run and a family to support, so justifying my time to work on this project is based on how much the community supports it. If I receive a lot of support from the community, you'll start seeing more content quicker, more detailed. I may even start to learn a bit more about the video editing, so you're not just stuck on a static screen like this for ages while I'm chatting away. But I need to justify the time involved in learning those things through the success of this channel before I start spending more time on it. So thank you very much for listening, and that's the end of this one.